Womanjika. It means welcome in Woiwurrung language. Actually, it means more than that. It means come with purpose. And I couldn't think of a more fitting phrase for the start of the Cricket Connecting Country series. My name is Mel Jones, and of all the hostings I've done as a commentator over this last little period of time, this certainly would be the most personal, but what I'm hoping will also be the most impactful as well. Cricket Australia has created a series of online panels designed to open up their media platforms so that we can reach as many cricket people, sports people as we possibly can. Fans, players, officials, administrators, anyone who wants to listen and learn about a variety of social issues that are impacting us daily. These discussions will be led by the voices that need to be heard, the voices that haven't had the microphone or the stage, the people that have often suppressed what they say to fit in, rather than saying that slightly confronting thing to make us more accountable for creating a sport for all. The plan is to do a real deep dive through open and honest chats into issues requiring immediate attention in Australia. Issues that we acknowledge have often been ignored, skirted around, or put on the back burner. Our first episode is a chance to celebrate our wonderful Indigenous cultures and multiculturalism in Australia. But also to acknowledge that on one hand, while we're celebrating these cultures, we have on so many occasions not been there for them. We know sport can be that vehicle for social change, and that cricket can play a role in uniting and inspiring all cultures to find common ground and to thrive through our clubs, associations and programs. To begin, I would like to invite Cricket Australia's Indigenous Engagement Specialist, Courtney Hagan, for the acknowledgement to country. Courts.
Thanks, Mel. On behalf of Cricket Australia, we'd love to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which our head office is located, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Naarm, which is Melbourne, Victoria. It's where Mel is hosting from, and it's where I'm standing right now. We'd love to pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I'd also like to acknowledge the First Nations people on the panel and those who are watching at home. Australia was, and always will be, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land.
I too would like to acknowledge the traditional lands that I'm sitting on for this webinar series as well, acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, as a public platform, we know not everyone will immediately understand or connect or even agree with everything that they hear. And some things might make you feel just a little bit uncomfortable or slightly defensive. I'm probably going to feel a little bit more comfortable over this next phase of time. But we are also trying to create space for a little discomfort, a little tension in the room, so we can start to train ourselves to not shy away from these moments of learning. We've told our panelists that this is a really safe space for them to speak their truth, and they can speak how they like of their experiences. And all we can ask is that people outside of the panel respect this as well. So today we have 4 amazing individuals to talk their truth. The first one, a global superstar on the T20 circuit, both internationally and domestically. And if I can put it this way, everywhere he goes and every competition he plays in, a certain title or trophy seems to follow him as well. That's how important he is. Currently with the Melbourne Renegades, he also had the honour of captaining the Indigenous 11 that toured the UK in 2018 to commemorate the 150 years since the 1868 tour, Aboriginal tour over there as well. Can we please welcome, very early in the morning and coming off some pretty good form for Knots, Dan Christian.
Hey Mel, how are you? Thanks for having me, guys.
Very well. Thank you so much for joining us. All good over in England?
Going well, yeah. We're off to a nice start here at Knots. We've had 2 wins and a washout, so we're going all right.
Okay, well you are in England. Okay. Our second guest has her fingerprints all over both on and off-field success with the Australian women's cricket team. As a player, Rach has been integral to the batting lineup for the Australian team, and then as a leader has been pivotal in all their success over recent times, in particular the big win at the MCG on March 8 on International Women's Day in the T20 World Cup final. Rachael Haynes, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Mel. It's great to be here.
And winter at home, how's the training going?
Yeah, so it's been really nice actually to spend some time at home because we had such a busy 12 months leading into the World Cup. having said that, I'm probably getting itchy feet like most people and ready to start traveling again. But yeah, obviously with the pandemic, yeah, that's pretty challenging. But we're looking forward to our series against New Zealand in a couple of weeks' time.
It's absolutely wonderful to have you on today. Our next guest is a lawyer, writer, and accomplished public speaker. She is a vocal advocate for human rights, multiculturalism, and the settlement of people with refugee experiences and those seeking asylum. A multi-award winner for her work to combat racism and her advocacy and activism on behalf of the Australian, African, and Melbourne's South Sudanese communities. Nyadol Nyuon, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you for having me. I can't believe I said welcome to. I think I'm still recovering from death by Zoom slowly.
Yes, it is a little bit like that, isn't it? I've got to put it out there to start with. A little bit of a fangirl of yours. And when you do some research, and I've been watching you on television for so long, I know that you arrived here at 18. You spent a lot of your youth in refugee camps. When an 18-year-old Sudanese girl comes to Australia, she sees cricket for the first time, what does she think?
Well, cricket and AFL, I just thought, what random weird game, a ball. It didn't make sense a lot, but you start spending quite a bit of your summer watching the cricket and then the winter watching football, and it grows on you, and before you know it, you're one of those crazy people, and quite surprising yourself.
Well, welcome to our crazy clan. It's fantastic to have you on. And our final guest is a very proud Narangana woman from the Port Pierce area in South Australia, who has dedicated her career to the Indigenous health sector through roles in nursing, management and policy over the last 2 decades. She's the current CEO of the Lowitja Institute, Australia's National Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Research. Welcome, Dr Janine Mohamed.
Thanks for having me, Mel.
Now, Janine, when I see nurse, South Australian, Indigenous, I think of Faith Thomas, our first Australian Indigenous athlete way back in 1958. Do you know Faith?
Yeah, I'm very proud to say that I actually met her and I held her baggy green. She's an absolute star, a hero, and yeah, got a great sense of humour.
That she certainly does, one of our absolute legends of the game. Okay, before we get into the nitty-gritty of this panel discussion and we start to hear the real life experiences of racism from our panellists and the impact that it's had, let's revisit the nation's reaction to what Australia's Black Lives Movement started as.
Black Lives Matter! No peace! No racism! No peace! No racist! No peace! No justice! No peace! No racist! No peace!
Of us to get our names on the Constitution, we still haven't even breathed!
I can't breathe!
May 25, George Floyd's death in the US triggered a wave of marches across the globe. Black Lives Matter marches were conducted at the peak of COVID and in lockdown, yet hundreds of thousands of people here in Australia still came out and marched. Janine, when you see Australia's response, how did that make you feel as an Indigenous person?
Well, in watching that footage, I can honestly say that my first emotion is pride. I'm really proud that tens of thousands of Australians, joined the Black Lives Matter marches, not just in this country, but obviously globally. Our family joined the marches wherever we were placed. We're sending photos to each other proudly, and we joined because when we saw, the treatment of George Floyd, and importantly, and I underscore importantly, the non-actions of those watching, we connected with those images on many levels and really wanted to show our solidarity in our lived and shared experiences. I suppose the images really reminded me of being in that march that day and the thoughts and emotions that washed over me as we marched, and I really reflected on the patience of our ancestors, and I reflected on the 437 Indigenous people who've died in custody since the Royal Commission, which was back in the 1990s. Doesn't feel like forever ago, but it's a long time now. And, you know, of that 437 people that have died, no one has ever been convicted of those deaths, and we were reminded of that day. You know, the stories of Miss Do and Miss Day, who painfully and violently died, again, an underscore, preventable deaths. And these are names that we shouldn't know, you know, in the Australian public. These were Indigenous women. The unacknowledged or uncounted massacres of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people since colonisation, all in the name of law, you know, and they aren't counted in that 437. I thought of the children in this country, the Aboriginal children who make up 100% of the juvenile justice system in the Northern Territory, and that as a country we still maintain that it's okay to lock up a child as young as 10 in a prison. You know, one would have to reflect on us as a society to think that that's okay. And of course, the failure of the system to act as well when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children have gone missing. And I know of the 3 Aboriginal children in a small town of Barraville who went missing in the 1990s, and their families waited for decades for action. And again, those of us who grew up in the 70s, 60s and 70s would know the faces of the Beaumont children who disappeared in South Australia, where I'm from. You know, journalist people have searched for decades for them. We know their faces, but do we know the faces of the Barraville children? So this, you know, this treatment or this inaction sends a message. It's a value statement to all of us, to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to people of colour, to non-Indigenous Australians, about the value of a black life. And we know that this is the experience of Indigenous peoples and peoples of colour worldwide. And at our rallies, we acknowledged and shared that pain. And once more in this country, Indigenous people led the call, if you like, for justice in Australia. And as you've already mentioned, Mel, you know, the Australian narrative, some of the media that came out after, was that this isn't an Australian issue. It was denied. It was even denied that slavery is an issue. It was an issue in this country. And of course, I know that that's my oral history. Absolutely, there is slavery in this country. But it was trivialised and undermined, and it was placed as Black Lives Matter as the problem. And, you know, even one of our leading health officials weaponised the movement by stating all lives matter. And of course, all lives would matter if Black lives did. So that was my reflection. You
started with, you were very proud, and then you went through a whole gamut of emotions there. Is that one of the, I suppose, the tough things as an Indigenous person to deal with, is just the full range of emotions that something like this brings out, not just on one day of a march, but every single day of your life?
On the daily, you know, the celebrations and then knowing the backlash of those celebrations. And of course, as Indigenous peoples, we're often asked to speak on behalf of not just us as individuals, but of our whole race. And that's also difficult, you know, to be having those water cooler conversations to defend that Black Lives Matter. So in the celebrations, there's also the hard discussions that follow, that are always hard to have language around. But, you know, in those difficult conversations is often where the magic happens if people really want to learn.
Yeah. Nyadol, I might move to you. I'm going to ask you a similar question, but before I get to that, I want to get your sense of experience of racism pre you coming to Australia as an 18-year-old and then arriving here in Australia as well. What was your experience in that front?
Well, I'd experienced, so I grew up in Kenya and moved between the refugee camp that was located in the northern part of the country and sometimes stayed in Nairobi with extended family members. And so, I mean, I experienced discrimination. Kenyans tend to have a much lighter shade in the skin color. South Sudanese are some of the darkest people you come across. You know, now those called names and murk for walking down the street. But I don't know, it just, coming to Australia and experiencing racism here is quite different, because in Kenya, you sort of got the abuse online if you're shopping. I mean, you're walking on the street and stuff and people laugh and all that. And you knew that you were different because you were a refugee and and displaced into their country. But I don't think I ever fully appreciated that I was a Black person until I came to Australia, and what that actually means, and how the layers of history of colonization, of slavery, and the historical justification of the idea that Black people are inferior, how those things sort of intersect much more, and the kind of layer of difficulty it presented. So my early experiences here were, from schools where I experienced racism in school. That was really, teachers would just dismiss it and say, oh, it's just bullying, although it's a different type of bullying. I think it's quite different when you're being bullied because of something that somehow, some things you can't change, but most things maybe you can change. But when it's inherently who you are, if it's your race and your skin color, it's different to really bullying, and ignoring it. It's almost as if you're being told to ignore that you happen to be Black walking these spaces. And then, we had some really traumatic incidents living in certain places. I had family members threatened with a knife. With my brothers stopped using a particular street at some point because of the racist abuse we were receiving from the neighbors on that street. And what I found fascinating, and I say fascinating if you step away and look at it, it's how Australia is, talk about racism. The moment you mention racism, you become the problem. It's like you are causing trouble, you are making people uncomfortable, and to use Donald Trump words, you came from a shithole country. Like, what do you have to complain about now that you were, another phrase you could use, given all these things? You didn't earn an education, you didn't sort of work hard for it. They were just given to you because you happen to be in this country. And what you're expected to demonstrate is this performance of gratefulness all the time. So there is no permission to analyze your existence as a country, as a citizen, both from the grateful aspect of it and from the non-grateful aspect of it, the harder part. Because life is about good and bad, and I find that there is no room in the public discourse to speak about that without certain segments of the community having a very strong reaction to it. And I think, that reaction was displayed in the reaction to the Black Lives movements. So you had, and I pause at this point to say that this was really, Black Lives movement in Australia was led by Indigenous First Nation people. I mean, if it wasn't their courage and their action and their planning and their organization, it wouldn't have sort of taken root the way it did. And I think that, for Indigenous Australians or First Nation people who are already dealing with their own inherent dispossession and historical injustices, to so willingly show solidarity for what is happening across another country, really, to me, demonstrated that, the role that Indigenous people, I think, in this country have played in pushing us forward. Like they've been the sort of group that have agitated for a much more expansive idea of what it means to be Australian. They're the one who have sort of, demanded that the notions that we celebrate as a country are actually spread across the board. And with that kind of agitation, I think we'll be a much, much more poorer country in the way we approach issues of immigration and integration generally. I'll make some final point about generally about the Black Lives Movement. So what I observed was that you sort of saw the kind of grassroots movement that was being led, and that was a mass reaction of people that went and demonstrated and protested. And my little sister, she lives in Ballarat and traveled down just for the demonstration. And I know a lot of Black kids that joined that demonstration. What was missing was any sort of position taken by those in power that sort of said, we acknowledge why you respond to this in this manner. So there was this parallel reaction of grassroots movement. But if you look at certain dominant media spaces and even political leadership, what happened was a clear pushback, pushback to say, you are importing American problems in this country. A statement that clearly neglects the historical injustices and the ongoing consequences of those historical injustices on Indigenous people, first of all. And things that says, things are not as bad as they are here things are not as bad in Australia as they are in the United States was another form of pushback. And of course, it's almost, it's for me, it's almost understandable that people in leadership positions will say that, because they come from technically a particular class of people that don't have to walk and experience this world, being an Indigenous child and having your face pushed down in an arrest by the police, or having to know what it was like to grow up as a First Nation person here, hearing stories about, you know, your family members being ripped from their families and taken away. And so to them, yes, Australia has never been like America because they've never lived these experiences. So it's kind of that parallel that can get really toxic, because then those with power, unfortunately, those who suffer and those with power are two different people. And those in power continuously either introduce directly counter narrative to undermine the efforts of those who are suffering to try and change things.
Janine, I saw you nodding along a lot to what Nyadol had to say there. I'm trying to figure out which one is the best one to pick up on, because there were so many great points. I would like to ask you though, racism has basically been a social construct out of, Nyadol mentioned it beautifully, in terms of coming out of the slave trade. If it was socially constructed, it sort of says to us that we can deconstruct it then in some ways. So I would love to get your thoughts on potential ways in which people can start to do that process. Is it cultural awareness programs? Is it education? Is it having the conversations?
Yeah, and it is a social construct. I mean, it comes out of Darwinism, you know, and the theory of evolution. If you've ever seen the, you know, the picture of the man going from an ape up to a man, he actually changes colour. So, you know, there is some, you know, there is some messaging in that, and it's also about survival of the fittest. You know, colonisation had a particular end point in it, which is that, you know, it wanted Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to go away. So there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in, you know, what Nyadol was saying. It's disrupting people's truths, you know, and really making people uncomfortable. But as I said before, you know, and your question is, if people can begin to unpack historical truth-telling and intergenerational traumas that have happened and accept that, you know, that's one place that as a nation we can move forward, and really understand why we have some of the biases we do and why racism exists. But I think your question, Mel, really was about, you know, what responsibilities are there and what could, you know, cricket do. Like a number of you know, sports in Australia, they have power, they have influence, they have a leadership role domestically and internationally. They have a massive reach, you know, in the Australian public. So I suppose it's a question back. I'm going to do, you know, a question back, which is kind of a journalist approach, which is what does Cricket Australia or Australian cricket want? You know, how does it want its history to be told? Does it want to be a bystander, or does it want to be a leader? You know, do they want to, you know, be the first to speak up and have those brave conversations, or do they want to wait for someone else? What's their legacy going to be? And I suppose a reflection, a good place to start is a reflection, and, you know, have a think about what they did in response to the Black Lives Matter campaign, and what will they say and what will they do next time? For me, I personally believe that sports do have a responsibility to have these brave conversations, you know, at a systems level, and ask some very critical questions of their own institutions, because today we're talking about, you know, institutional racism. So it's about the scaffolding, right, and the systems in which people operate. So, you know, for me, some of those critical questions are: how many Aboriginal cricket captains are there? How many Aboriginal people are on their boards that, you know, boards that actually have power and make decisions? How many Aboriginal commentators? Is there an anti-racism policy, and have they ever used it? You know, surely if you have one, you would have used it. So it's about having a vision and resourcing that vision, and putting your house in order, embedding it into your system so that, you know, it doesn't leave it up to individuals, because individuals leave, right? And so you want it built into the system. And then after that, it's inviting people into your house who believe in that vision. People who will make a commitment to lifelong learning, because this is about lifelong learning, you're never perfect, and to understand about anti-racism and cultural safety, which is an understanding about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. We're beautifully, diverse, so you can never know all there is to us. So there's no tick list. You actually have to understand yourself and all of the things, the thoughts, processes that you bring into the room, and really understanding why you bring those into the room. And of course, one of the big things that, most successful organisations and peoples understand is that you have to be prepared to make mistakes and learn from them, but continue to focus on the vision. And of course, I'm speaking to the converted because sports really do understand this. If it's about, a vision to winning the Ashes, be it in England or here, people work for years and prepare for many years, in preparing for that vision to come true. So that's just a few pointers about where to start.
I'm going to be looking over my shoulder and my position on the board because I think someone's after it a little bit. That would be... No, I just want to finish with you. And this is a more broader question in and around people of colour, and particularly women, trying to find their voice in this space, because I know that you yourself have got a lot of flack social media wise and trolling and a lot of unwarranted comments about you finding your voice. And I think that's a big space for people to not only just to find their voice, but to know when to use it, to know how strongly to use it at times, when not to use it. What would be your advice to young Indigenous women out there that are wanting to make a difference and use their voice?
Yeah, I mean, starting with the caveat that I am not, a First Nation woman, and I think it's important that I say that, because my presence in this land is, as radical as it might sound, a continuation of the colonization process. And so I have to admit that, I wasn't welcomed here by Indigenous people. I was welcomed here by a system that dispossessed them of their land. So I'm a beneficiary of that system. And so I think it's important that I acknowledge that, because sometimes we especially settled immigrants, we forget that when we come to this country, we can participate in the erasure of Indigenous people. Whether we're invited into platform to speak about racism, as if I can talk about racism of 13 years being in this country, while Indigenous people have almost over 200 years of that history. So that's the first. It's that, and maybe that leads to the first point, is that nobody can tell your story better than you. Nobody can. And a lot of finding your voice is courage. If you're a woman of color, it's clearly shown by research that your presence online is going to attract some level of abuse that is racist. And so these spaces are unlikely to be the safest spaces for us. But at the same time, they're also a platform that is much more fairly balanced than the mainstream media outlets we have, which is predominantly the presenters, the commentators, and the decision makers are predominantly, Anglo-Saxon. So that means that the way they tell stories, the stories they prioritize, the angle they take, it was quite interesting during when the Black Lives Movement, when I think it was a journalist, Australian journalist in the United States, who was saying that we don't somehow understand things like this happening in Australia. And that kind of gives you an insight into, how different it would have been for Indigenous journalists to have been present there and bring the collective history of it. So I think, admitting that it's going to be hard, but that, but having the courage to speak up, and knowing, not so much what other people are going to do, but what your limits are. Because I think Black women and women of color generally take on a lot. Like you've got your daily job to do, and then you feel the additional responsibility to represent your people and your group the best you can. And I think that can then want to entrench you in keeping the fight up, even when your body and your mind is telling you to take a rest. So I think that's another advice I'll give, is to take a rest. And if I can go back just to the comment that you asked Dr. Janine Mohamed to address in terms of what we can do. There was a wonderful, I think it was wonderful, but there was a speech delivered by, I think it's Paul Keating, a while back about how our institutions need to start reflecting who Australia is. And those institutions can vary from physical institutions but also institutions like the Constitution itself. There's, of course, the diversity of view. Some Indigenous people don't want to be recognized in the Constitution at all. But the debate about how we prioritize which stories we lift up and indeed fund and portray as an Australian identity says something about how willing this country is to change. To show some examples, we've got 26th of January as Australia Day. Indigenous people have been campaigning for a long time to say this date is actually harmful to us. It reminds us of when colonization and genocide began. And despite the fact that this country has sort of changed that date before, all of a sudden there's a group of people that are so wedded to this date that will not even get to a conversation about changing it, And it's interesting because it makes you realize that we do prioritize a particular identity, a particular story about this country. And that story is continuing to neglect, one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. So I think we deny ourselves as a country the opportunity to learn from the stories and the history and the struggles that Indigenous people bring to the table. And so if my final advice would be that there is so much worth in humanity in who you are already, despite the constant media coverage and the stories you hear and the loss you experience through your community. It doesn't diminish the worth of First Nations people and their ability to transform the country.
Yeah, very well said. I'm going to bring in Daniel and Rach here, but before I do, let's hear from some of our leading Indigenous cricketers.
I just got so many arguments with my mates saying like I'm Aboriginal, like this is me people, this is my culture. I'd tell them a story that I'm telling you guys about my nan and things like this, and they just wouldn't want to borrow it. They say, no, but you're white.
Yeah, I get it every day, essentially. Anytime you meet someone and it's the you're not, or you're telling me Aboriginal and yet you're not, or how much are you, or I don't know. It's depending on what mood I am and how much I like the person, you'll get two different answers.
People saying, what's the difference? How black do you have to be? Or what's the ratio? What's this guy? 0.016% or something like that. That's the sort of stuff that gets you down.
And then they go, well, what are you? And for me, it's, I was like, well, what's it matter? Like, what are you? You say you're Irish, how much Irish are you? You never ask someone that, do you? So what's it to you?
If you've got some coffee and you keep pouring milk in it, it gets lighter and lighter, obviously, but it doesn't matter how much milk you put in it, there's still coffee, you know what I mean? So, and it's just, do you want to keep calling it coffee or you're just going to call it milk? So that's probably the easiest one I do. I like to keep things simple, so everyone can relate to that.
Dan, if you had $1 for every time someone said to you, you're Aboriginal, how Aboriginal are you? What's your percentage? How rich would you be?
Yeah, I'd be a rich man, I think, Mel. It's it's just something that comes, I think, with just a lack of education and an ignorance. I don't think a lot of people say it with any kind of malice. It's just that they don't understand and just don't know. When all the Black Lives Matter stuff came out in the last few weeks or the last couple of months, one of the things that I related to the most was Main Wyatt's monologue that he did on Q&A, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. And there was one little section of that where he talked about being asked that question and his comment back to whoever asked it was, well, what part am I? Is it my foot? Is it my arm? Is it my leg? And that was one thing that, I've had those kind of questions a lot. And yeah, that was a pretty good way to look at it, I think.
The whole phrase of sense of identity seems so intrinsically wrapped up in Indigenous people. How important is it, if we took that phrase out of your daily life, how much would that impact you as an Indigenous man, but the entire culture? Would it just give you just more space to educate people and just to be?
Yeah, I think so. It just seems totally unnecessary. It shouldn't really matter, particularly in a cricket sense. For me, it doesn't matter what where you come from, what you look like. It's all about how you perform on a field. That's all we kind of look at. And to have things like that sort of hanging over the top of you, it just shouldn't be like that, and it shouldn't be like that in the rest of society either. So I think it's wonderful that we're at least having the conversation now, and hopefully that will just keep cricket will keep going in that direction, and we can keep getting more and more young kids involved in the game and interested in the game, and particularly get more cricket followers to be educated and interested in our culture.
Yeah. Rach, we had a chat last week in preparation for this panel, and I don't know if you can remember exactly what you said, but I thought you nailed it when I asked why. Why did you want to be involved?
Yeah, well, I think, for a long time, I want to learn more. I think that's the big thing is, initially when I was asked to be involved in the panel, I was a little bit apprehensive because I thought, well, I am a white Australian, and am I the right person to be involved in this? We've got some fantastic diversity within our sport, and I think players could make a wonderful contribution on this. But I realised really quickly that I've got a responsibility as a leader within our sport to learn, and I've also got a responsibility within the sport to use my voice too. So they're the big things that stand out to me. And this is a really great learning opportunity for me. I'm listening to some of the contributions here and just going, wow, this is incredible, and challenging my thoughts and getting me to think differently as well. So that's probably the biggest thing.
When you say you were nervous, I completely understand that. And I think a lot of people probably listening in as well would understand the situation if they are white Australian. What can you sort of drill down to what that nervousness is really about?
I think probably the thing I didn't realise as I was younger and growing up was just how much of a privileged position that I came from. And, I look at my upbringing and it was middle class. It was no different, I think, to a lot of the people I was surrounded with. I don't come from money or anything like that, but actually, over my years, I've learned actually the colour of my skin potentially has made a huge difference to some of my experiences that I've had in my life. So, I think I need to have a better understanding as well of other people's experiences and potentially some of the adversities that they've faced. And so for me, that's, where I see my role is listening to other people's stories. And as I said before, also providing advocacy where I can as a leader within our sport.
Dan, you're a proud Wiradjuri man. You captained the Australian men's Indigenous team back in 2018. I was lucky enough to see the team over in England. Can you pinpoint a couple of moments that just made you exceptionally proud to be part of that squad?
Hard to pinpoint one or two, Mel. It was just that it was a wonderful trip. Everything about the trip, even leading into it, myself and Ash Gardner as the captain of the women's team, we both got to go down to Canberra and spend some time with the PM and some of the other ministers down there and talk about the tour and talk about what was going on with Indigenous cricket. Going to Lords, actually, now that I think about it, going to Lords and spending a day with the Australian men's team there and having a look around the place and how well they accepted us. And one of the coolest things we got to be involved with was to go into that change room with Justin Langer and the team, and he got Nathan Lyon to sing the team song, which for anyone that knows their cricket and knows how important that song is to the Australian team, it was that was an amazing experience and wonderful to be a part of, to see those guys, to see that team welcome us into that change room and accept that this is the way that the sport needs to go, I think was really important. It was a really special moment.
I'm going to ask you, and it's probably a hard one to answer in some respects. You certainly don't want to call people out, but I'd love to get from you, Dan, just a sense of the level of racism in cricket. Have you experienced it? Is it as big an issue as what we're starting to understand, and what can Australian cricket do about it?
I think it is. I think it is an issue in Australian cricket. I don't think it's. I don't think it's as in your face as what you might see elsewhere around the world, or even elsewhere in Australian culture. I think it's definitely there. It's more of a casual racism of just little throwaway lines here and there made to be jokes. And a lot of that for me personally has been around the colour of my skin and the fact that I don't look Aboriginal, for whatever that means. That's probably the most noticeable thing for me. However, I do think, having I've received a lot of messages in the last few months from people that I've played with and against that have said, sorry if I've ever, said anything to you that you've been offended by. Please help. Please, I'd love to know some more about, whatever it might be, your personal story, your family story, things that I can do in the community to try and help out. And I think, so from that perspective, I think it's been a wonderful thing to have happened, to be able to having that conversation and for people to want to make change.
Rach, I didn't want to throw it to you, but I have to throw it to you on this one because I know that you yourself haven't experienced racism, but personally, but you've certainly been in and around it and have heard it in Australian sort of cricket environments.
Yeah, I have. And I when I did hear it, I was really taken aback in the moment and the situation, because it came from a place. It didn't come from a teammate or the actual team environment. It came from a place surrounding that, and in a moment where I didn't envisage that would happen. So and I did say something to call it out, but it really just sort of hit home to me that perhaps much to the points that have been raised around casual racism, even how it's ingrained, perhaps even in some younger children, not even really knowing that that's what they're being taught. So there's lots of things that we need to do to overcome that. How we talk in the media, how we call out behaviour. I think there's a huge role for sport to play in that, and we've started to see that as well. Even with other codes, people are really starting to call out poor behaviour. In AFL, we've seen that a lot on social media. So I think sport has a huge role to play in trying to make people accountable for some of the things that they're saying.
Most cricket fans will remember Michael Holding as the perfect specimen of a fast bowler and part of the feared West Indian attack of the 70s and 80s. Whispering Death was his nickname. On Sky Sport recently, he used his words to deliver cricket's first real acknowledgement of the impact of racism on black players in the game.
No one is born a racist, but the environment in which you grow, the society in which you live, encourages and teaches racism. Everybody has heard about this lady in the park with her dog who was asked by a black man in America to put her dog on a leash, which was the law, or which is the law. And she threatened this black man with her whiteness, saying that she was going to call the police and tell the police that there's a black man threatening her. If the society in which she was living did not empower her or to get her to think that she had that power of being white and being able to call the police on a black man, she would not have done it. It's just a reaction. It's an automatic reaction because of the society in which she lives. And that is what I'm talking about, teaching people. If you don't educate people, they'll keep on growing up in that sort of society and you'll not get meaningful change. And we're all human beings. So I hope that people will recognize that this Black Lives Movement is not trying to get black people above white people or above anyone else. It's all about equality. And when you say to somebody Black Lives Matter and they tell you all lives matter or white lives matter, please, we black people know white lives matter. I don't think you know that Black Lives Matter. So don't shout back at us about all lives matter. It is obvious, the evidence is clearly there that white lives matter. We want black lives to matter now. It's simple as that. History is written by the conqueror, not by those that are conquered. History is written by the people who do the harm, not by the people who get harmed. And we need to go back and teach both sides of history. And until we do that and educate the entire human race, this thing will not stop. They keep on telling me there's nothing called white privilege. Give me a break. I don't see any white people going into a store on Oxford Street and being followed. A black man walks in, somebody's following him everywhere he goes. That is basic white privilege.
whether that white person went in to rob the place or not, is not going to be thought of that way. And things like that have to change.
Dan, when I was a youngster playing backyard cricket, I was Malcolm Marshall or Michael Holding in the backyard. I think we all loved watching them play because I think there was sort of this invincibility about them. But then to see Mikey so vulnerable and hurt and emotional was exceptionally confronting for me and I think a lot of people. When you saw that, what was going through your mind?
Yeah, exactly that, Mel. Very, very confronting, particularly for someone who was seen as being, so invincible, as you say. He was an absolute superstar of the day, and that whole West Indian team were unbeatable there for a long time. They were just brilliant. So to hear that those guys went through that, it's not surprising, I suppose, but it's not something that I guess you thought about it too much because of how good they were. But I guess he's one of many. It's happened everywhere. It's happened all around the world. It's happened in our own country. Even just talking to my dad and my uncles and my aunties and the things that they've been through. It's all very, very relatable and unfortunately it's something that just has to change everywhere.
Rach, in sport in Australia, I think we're sort of wrapping our arms around a lot of different ways in which we can connect more to the truth and to history, and reconciliation rounds in AFL. For the Australian women's cricket team, they were involved in reconciliation games over in England on the recent Ashes tour as well. How did that open your eyes up to this whole space?
Yeah, well, I think the great thing about being involved with it was that it wasn't a superficial event. So quite often when we do things on the field, you walk out as a player and you're just part of that one moment, and then you move on and you play the game. One of the things that I really enjoyed about being involved in it was it started perhaps 6 months before that moment. So Cricket Australia came in and presented to us on the whole concept, and then spoke about the jersey that was going to get produced, and we did some activities leading into it as well to get an appreciation of Indigenous culture. And for me as a player, that was much more valuable rather than just stepping out onto the field and I guess going through the ceremony and not perhaps understanding different moments that you were part of. And I think that's something that sport has a responsibility to do is, just because the lights and the cameras are out and flashing, that's not just the moment that you're looking to capture. I think if you want to be impactful long term, you've actually got to take the opportunity leading in to educate the players on what they're doing and why they're doing it and what the opportunity is as well, rather than just getting them to step out onto a field and be part of a ceremony which is really symbolic and great to be part of, but that shouldn't be sort of where it stops and starts in my opinion.
Speaking of symbolic, Dan, you made the drive. I think it was about a 2.5 hour drive down. You had to get back for a game, but you weren't going to miss out on passing over Ash Gardner's baggy green cap. We spoke just before that moment. I don't think I've seen anyone so nervous in all my life. What did that moment mean to you?
It's a huge honour in itself to be playing Test cricket. So to be just the third Indigenous Australian's a huge honour and speaks volumes for your cricketing ability, your work ethic, and the love and respect and support that everyone around you must have.
Yeah, it was a huge moment because it's probably because of, or for a few different reasons. One for Ash, making a Test debut, to be a part of that, and to have that honour of handing over a cap, that was huge for me, and a really, really, really special moment for me in my career. And leading into it, I gave Arnie Faith a call and gave Jason Gillespie a call, the two other Indigenous people that have played Test cricket for Australia, and spoke to them. Arnie Faith being the funniest one, she said, "Tell Cricket Australia to send me a car and get me over to England as soon as you can, please." And I said, "No, you're not going to be able to get there." Yeah, so it was nice to have a chat with her. She was hilarious. But yeah, just being a part of that and having the chance to do that with Ash, particularly having been over there with her 12 months before as captains of both the men's and women's Indigenous teams for that tour. yeah, it was really special. Just sort of touching on one thing Rach said earlier. Before I started playing cricket, I was working for the government in the Indigenous employment branch in the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations in the early 2000s. And one of the first things I did when I had that job, and the whole department had to go through it, was cross-cultural awareness training. And so you learnt all sorts of things about, you know, our own culture and our other cultures and how to integrate and all that stuff. It was all really, really interesting, fantastic, relevant stuff. And that was in the early 2000s. And I've been playing cricket ever since, and not once have I ever been through any kind of training or heard about any kind of training like that throughout cricket.
Yeah.
So that's one thing we could at least do to raise some awareness and to educate people within our sport. And I just don't think that's something that we've ever looked at in the past. And I think it's a you know, particularly now, it's a great chance to really to do something like that.
Anyone listening in into this, I'm presuming, wants to be a part of the solution, which is certainly the first step. It's, as they say, we're all leaning in. The movement, though, is only a movement if we keep acting. We need to keep it as viable and in front of people's eyes and ears as much as we possibly can. So that's up to us, everyone involved, the people on the panel and people listening in as well, to do something every day, not just when it's prompted by a new news story. So what I'm going to ask each of our panellists to finish up here today is to think about just that one little piece of advice that they'd like to pass on to people about what they can do every day so that we can expand this allyship. So I'm going to start just to give everyone a little bit of time to have a little bit of think about things. And I'll start with a quote. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows. You don't fix the flower. So from that point, all I would ask is that you take time to start to educate yourself, and you can do that in a variety of ways. Rachel Haynes spoke about it earlier as well. You can start to speak to people. There's loads of videos out there. I have, at the moment, a pile of books, which is fantastic as a Melburnian in COVID lockdown to get through. Absolutely outstanding. Social media, start following people, but just be active and have a touch base each day just to see how you're going. I might start with Nyadol. What would you say pass on to people if they want to be an ally in this?
In addition to educate yourself, if you're going to be an ally, the first thing you need to develop is a muscle to accept that it's going to be very uncomfortable and that you're going to make mistakes, and that the reaction of those who have had to deal with racism and injustice might not be the most polite. So sometimes I've seen people who say that they're allies after they've been, you know, criticized or a fault pointed out, saying, well, you know, how am I going to be on your side if this is how you treat, you know, you treat people who are trying to support you. So what I would say is that, you know, learning is an uncomfortable process because it is part of unlearning something that has become part of your identity or part of your assumption systems. So the commitment is to the cause, you know, whether that, if you see that cause as equality or a fairer country, it is not to the particular argument you're having with the person that finds offense to what you've said. And so if you are in it, then have the faith that allows you to keep going and not the one that gets shaken when it becomes tough. And always remember that the people that are fought the longest war are those who have had to deal with racism and discrimination. And then finally, that history is not objective. The history that you have is clearly intended and manufactured to create the kind of society we have today and identify with. And because it's not objective and it's created, it means that we have an opportunity to create a different story. And that we are not powerless in insisting that we create a country that is fairer, more generous, more representative. What I think is happening now across the world partly is a fight to retell history. People have assumed that the history we've inherited historically is objective and is factual, but it's been incomplete. It's a history that told us about, you know, Captain Cook, but didn't tell us about the people that has been living here long before. It's an history that told us that nobody was here when in fact people had been here for thousands of years. So history that you inherit is not objective. And when people challenge it, they're challenging that it's be much more broader.
Rachael Haynes, your final words of wisdom?
Well, when I think about it from a sporting context, one of the reasons that I played cricket was it was a team sport, and I really enjoyed the whole concept of it being a shared experience. So part of that is learning off the people that you get to play alongside, hearing their stories, and sort of acknowledging perhaps what wasn't done well in the past, but learning and doing it differently in the future. So I think that's probably one of the areas that cricket could really take advantage of is there's some really great stories to tell within the sport. And as a sport, we need to listen to those and perhaps use those to, improve and really shape what we can be moving forward. That's the thing that stands out to me.
Dr Janine Mohamed?
We're 3% of the population, and there's 97% of the population that we need to get on this journey, this lifelong journey with us. That 97% usually are the ones that, have positions of power. And I think for too long, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples have been doing all the work, leading all the reconciliation action plans, the NAIDOC plans. We need people to step up and step into their responsibility in this space. So thank you. And in that education, we will understand that there is no silver bullet, to this. There's many things that need to be done, so many hands. And probably my parting comment is that we'll only ever travel at the speed of trust, and that we have to see beyond the mountain or in the land of the dream time, so we need to dream together.
Dan, Christian, you ready to dream together?
Yeah, it's I love that analogy you had there, Mel, yourself about the flower, and I think we've just got to educate ourselves. We need to and encourage everyone around us to educate themselves, and part of that education is calling it out and being and having the guts to call it out. That's the hardest thing, I think, to not just let it go and pretend it didn't happen, to confront someone when you hear about it and encourage your friends and people around you to call it out as well.
Absolutely brilliant. I cannot thank the four of you enough for your contributions today. Not just your contribution and time, but more so just the energy and the passion and the thought that you've put in to providing not just me, but everyone that's been listening to with your lived experiences. And that's what we've been saying is this is the starting point for a lot of people. We said that some of the things that we'll be talking about might make people a little bit uncomfortable. That's okay. We want to be a little bit uncomfortable at times so that we can make it a better place for everyone within our sport. So on behalf of Cricket Australia, we would like to thank everybody, as well as our wonderful panellists, for joining us here on Cricket Connecting Country. Most importantly, over the coming months, hopefully it's not too long, please be safe, be kind, and we hope to see you at the next episode.